the things that I think that are first and foremost important is that size business, whatever you're scaling it to, and the model that you're using to scale actually part of your definition of success, which goes back to, is that the business you really want? Right? Lately I've been paying more attention to, the title of our show has a reason. Right? Is it the business you really want?
Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. Are you constantly feeling the pressure to grow, to scale, to expand your business? If so, you're not alone. That seems to be sort of the forever advice that we see surrounding us in business, but especially those of us focused in online business. But what if we were to tell you that sometimes the most strategic business decision you can make is to stay small? My name's Tonya Kubo. I am here, as always, with Gwen Bortner. And today, the focus of the episode is to challenge the bigger is better mindset that tends to dominate entrepreneurial advice. What Gwen and I are going to do today is explore why intentionally limiting your business size can actually be your greatest competitive advantage, allow you to command premium prices, and still maintain the quality of life that probably led you to choose entrepreneurship in the first place. So to get us started, Gwen, could you just address that scale or die messaging that we seem to be surrounded with?
So I think it's driven by a lot of things. I think it's driven by our capitalistic structure, in the United States of, you've got to keep selling. You've got to keep selling. You've got to be doing more. You've got to be doing more all the time. It's got to be bigger. It's got to be better. If you're not growing by X percent every year, you're a failure. Any combination of versions of that messaging that we see all over. I mean, I'd love to blame social media for all this kind of stuff all the time. And I think it has increased it. But that was there long, long, long before the internet even existed. So this is not new news. And I think that that's part of the issue, for sure. I also think that there has been a kind of standard messaging out there of, if you're not scaling, you're working too hard. Which there's probably some truth in that, because usually there's always a little bit of truth in most things, right? So there's probably a little bit of truth in that, but I don't think it's as universal as it's being presented. And I think that's always the problem, is that a lot of these things are presented as absolutes, as definites, as, those kind of things. And it's like, that's probably true or mostly true or partially true or something, but it's not absolutely true. And I think that that's the other issue that we're seeing there, is that it's become one of these things that if you don't scale, you must be doing it wrong. You must be working too hard. You're probably wasting time and energy, all of these things, which isn't necessarily true, because you might be exactly where you want to be, where you are right now.
Right. So, you know what you just made me think of. So I'm thinking of two things. So thing number one is, based on what you're saying, it implies that, first of all, the work you're doing at a small level is work you don't like doing.
Yes.
So I think that's one thing.
Right.
And I'll give a couple of examples in a second. And the second thing that it implies is that the type of work you're doing at the, say, individual or smaller level is either time intensive or energy intensive. It's hard work. And so what I think about is, so as a service provider, for instance, my business has had its own evolution. I mean, there was a time when I would be paid a set amount to do a thing. So maybe somebody hired me to write an article, like that's a service I no longer provide, just to be clear to anybody listening. And they may pay me $35 an hour to write an article under the idea that an article might take 4 hours, and that's about how much they were willing to pay for an article. And then I went to a model where I could promise a set of deliverables, say 4 articles per month at a different rate, right? So I'm no longer getting penalized if I can write faster.
Right.
Right.
You could potentially write 4 articles in 4 hours.
Right. Depending on what the article is. Right. So rather than getting paid hourly just for the act of writing, I started getting paid for the finished product. And then, I may decide, this was not the path I went, but I could have decided, okay, well, now I'm going to go to a retainer model. You pay me to be your writer for a month, regardless of what my deliverables are. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to scale that out while still working on a very one-to-one level. And then there's the other model, and this is where I think a lot of this scaling messaging comes from, which is the assumption that your ultimate goal is to get out of the work, which is back to the initial point I made, is it assumes you don't like the work. And this is where you are the high-level consultant, and then the business model that you switch to is rather than making money through your consulting services, you start making money by teaching other people how to be high-level consultants.
Right.
What are the hidden costs, do you think, when it comes to scaling? And let's start with the hidden costs of scaling that we kind of know, but maybe not everybody knows. But then also, I want to know about the ones that you see that aren't getting discussed.
Well, the things that I think that are first and foremost important is that size business, whatever you're scaling it to, and the model that you're using to scale, actually part of your definition of success, which goes back to, is that the business you really want? Right? Lately I've been paying more attention to, the title of our show has a reason. Right? Is it the business you really want? Do you want to just, and I say just, not that it's and all you have to do is, but do you only want to be the CEO and no longer be a part of delivering the services? Right? Or do you want to have a cadre of consultants, working for you? Or, the list goes on and on and on, right? That's the first piece. Is this the business you really want? And I think that's the question that nobody takes the time to first ask. Now, here's the other reality is sometimes we don't know that's not what we want until we go down that path. And it's like, oh, everyone said this would be awesome and I don't really like it at all.
Right.
Right. But this is also, where we started this conversation almost a year ago now, is people were talking about burning down their business. Well, I think a lot of the reasons people were burning down their business is because someone advised them to go down a path, usually some sort of a scaling path. And when they realized it was no longer the business that they wanted, they didn't know how to back out of it in a reasonable way. So they burned the whole thing down. But the problem is, unless they're really clear on where that transition happened, they're going to go down the exact same path again.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the only thing they know. They may say, oh no, but this time I'm stopping here. Okay, that's probably good. but it doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't have done something different at that inflection point. But whatever that decision point was. And I think that's where the one of the biggest challenges comes in, is that we have to be really clear about what is it about the business that you really want.
Right. Okay. So before we can really talk about the costs associated of scaling, we first have to get clear on what we want, because the ultimate cost that
I'm sorry, but because sometimes the cost is totally worth the benefit.
Well, I was going to say sometimes the cost is that you wake up one day and you go, how did I get here?
Right. And that's the other side. Sometimes and two people could take that, it's never the exact path, but the exact same path, and each have that same answer.
Mm-hmm.
Right. One have the answer of, oh my God, how did I get here? And the other one's like, oh, this is totally what I wanted.
Right.
Right. So the path itself is not a problem. It's
right. And I would say, what I have seen from supporting other businesses that have scaled, the costs, as much as I would love to give everybody a list of 10 hidden costs that are rarely discussed, the costs vary according to the business owner.
Very, very much.
Business owner A's costs could be that they've transitioned from providing a service to clients they love to now managing a bunch of people, which they don't love, so that those people can effectively provide services to the client they love. And the cost is that they're now distanced from the end user, which does not make them happy. They don't feel like they're have their hand in the impact. Like all of those things, right? Because they didn't sign on to be a people manager. They signed on to deliver a service. But for somebody else, that could be a huge benefit. Like, yay, I'm not having to do the fulfillment. I just get to develop and manage a team. But for them, the hidden cost could simply be the overhead associated with a team-based business versus when they were solopreneurs.
Right. Right. And I think that's where it's tricky to say what are the costs, because I think there's lots of hidden costs, and this is a place of, does this cost feel costly?
Yeah. Or cost effective, as it were.
Right. Or does it feel like it's an investment?
Yeah. So then let's set that aside and ask the question, growth for growth's sake. Like, what comes as a result of that versus, say, growth via intentional design?
So I do think growth for growth's sake almost always leads to burnout.
Okay.
I think almost always, because back to, it's not necessarily what someone really wants. They have bought into the bigger is better, scale is the right answer, all of those things. And I, most of the people that are talking about burning down their business, they're not burning down like somebody that just barely hit six figures. Right. That's not what's happening. They're burning down businesses that grew and scaled in giant ways. And I think it's that is the growth for growth's sake, is they were just doing it because everyone said when they got six figures, well, you need to have a high six figures. So they got high six figures. No, you need to have seven figures. So they got seven figures. In some cases, you got seven figures, you need to have eight figures, without them actually evaluating, was that what they were wanting, in the process. It was just because it's the easiest number to measure.
Yeah.
Right? It's the easiest number to measure. We get very fixed on income as a measurement. Now, we do have to pay attention to the financials because that really is how businesses keep score. But income really is not the number. It's a number, but it's not the number. And we have gotten fixated on it being the number. And so what, I've talked to business owners who went from, a nice, comfortable upper six-figure business into a 7 and 8 figure business. And not only are they more stressed out and freaked out and overwhelmed and all the rest of it, but they're also putting less money in their pocket. They're actually making less money. Well, why is that? Because they were growing. They were growing and, and were they scaling? Probably not, because part of the real definition of scaling is you're doing more with less resources. Right. So you really should be making a bigger profit on that. Right. But choosing what things do you want to scale? Because that's the other thing I think that people forget is that they scale everything. And I don't think the entire business always has to have everything scaled.
Yeah.
Right. Depending on what you want, because there is a price for scaling. That usually means you're taking on some additional ongoing expenses. Now, if you have scaled well and revenue, you've designed it so revenue is relatively consistent, then those additional expenses are not scary. Right? If you've got $100,000 coming in every month and you've got a $10,000 or $20,000 set of expenses every month, that's not actually that scary, right? Because it's not a huge percent. But if you've got $100,000 coming in every month and you've got $80,000 that you absolutely have to cover, or people are not getting their paychecks and other things, that's a little scary because it doesn't take much for that $100,000 to become $80,000 in that income category, right? And so part of it is that piece of, is it the risk that I'm willing to take? And what do you have in your own coffers, right? I know folks that it's a little tight, but they actually planned for their business to grow this way. And so they've got money saved away. So yeah, if it gets a little tight this month, it's okay. I've got money I can pull out of, my business savings account to cover this, because I also know this is the way it's going to be for a bit.
Yeah. So what would you say, because we're about a third of the way through our time here. And so I'd like to shift us to really the topic of the episode, like the title of the episode, which is, what are the strategic advantages of staying small? Which ones come to mind for you?
So I think, first off, the strategic advantages of staying truly, truly small. And I think everyone that we talk to falls into the small category. I mean, even if you've got 10 or 20 employees, you can make adjustments and pivots so much easier. And when you do, there is so much less impact on yourself, your business, your employees, your systems, your processes. Right. It really is about, are you trying to turn the Titanic?
Fair enough.
And so I think, that is one of the advantages of staying smaller. Now, people can argue about how small is small, right? Because some folks are like, oh, company with 100 employees, that's really big. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people would say, no, that's still really, really, tiny and microscopic. But I think it's something that you do have to consider as you're starting to scale is how quickly will you be able to adjust as you get to be a larger business, and how important is that to you?
Right.
Right. For a lot of businesses, that's not actually that important because they're not needing to make massive adjustments all the time, because their environment is not an environment that gets impacted directly by lots of outside factors. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the pandemic a number of years back that impacted everybody in ways that people didn't plan. And but there are business models that get impacted by outside forces all the time. They're always being impacted by weather, something we can't control. They're always being impacted by, economic factors, something that most of us can't control. And so I think that's also part of it is how stable is the thing that you're offering and the environment that you're offering it in.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. I was thinking also, let's first, let me just kind of pull out some of what I've heard you say leading up to this point. So, one benefit of staying small can be lower overhead costs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Simplified operations, right? Because if you don't have 22,000 departments, you're automatically simplified.
Right.
But even 5 departments, which I think is kind of average for the small business that's in a growth mode. I mean, that's a lot to manage. That is a lot to manage.
Every time you add a person into the communications network of any business, you're not just adding 1 additional or 2 additional lines of conversation. It becomes exponential. And so, 3 people talking is a relatively simple line drawing of where they all connect. 4 people isn't very bad, but 5 starts to get ugly. And when you get to 7 or 8, which still is not very many, it's like, I'm old enough to remember spirograph, where you would draw a little line around. I mean, it starts looking like a spirograph. I mean, there are lots and lots of connections. So that communication piece is another piece that it's way easier to communicate in a smaller organization. Right. And as soon as you start to scale, that communication piece really is an exponential curve.
Right. Okay. So you've got lower overhead costs, you've got simplified operations. You mentioned, flexibility to pivot quickly without having these big organizational constraints. I think that's something when we started this show, we were, part of it was a response to all of these very outwardly successful, highly visible business owners talking about burning their business to the ground or having a deep desire to really just tear down the entire structure of the business and rebuild it. And a lot of what drove that feeling was they had built their business into such a large organization that it became a monster, and they were no longer working to serve their end user or working to fulfill their passion. They were working to feed the monster.
Right. Right.
So those are some of the advantages you mentioned. I'm curious. So this is something that I have been exploring with my own business. I've been talking to some other business owners who do the same. The idea that a boutique business can command higher prices, either by being exclusive or offering a level of personalization that a more scaled out business can't. Do you see that play out? Is that industry specific, I guess, or is that something that is kind of widely applicable? I think those are the words.
I think it depends.
Okay.
I really do think it depends. I think that in some cases you can justify higher prices when it's boutique because, let's be honest, we expect to pay differently for a group experience than we do for a one-on-one experience.
Right.
Right. But I'll say the scaling, proponents will say, yeah, but you as the provider are making more providing to a group experience because you're getting less per person, but you've got more persons in the room.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that becomes part of that's when you can kind of argue on either side, but also part of it is what energizes you.
Right.
Right. Because if having one-on-one conversation energizes you and having to manage a group, even a small group, really, really drains you, are you actually better off energy-wise doing 3 one-on-one sessions versus 1 hour session where maybe you make about the same money? I mean, I'm randomly putting, dollars to it, but let's just say 3 1 hour sessions one-on-one may make the same money as a 1 hour, small group session. But if your energy at the end of that is way higher, how do you put a price tag on that?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and so, but that comes down to an individual, right? That is not a right answer or a wrong answer, because there's other people that the thought of doing a 1 hour one-on-one session with anybody is the most draining thing on the planet. But
right.
yeah, I could totally do it because if it's 10 people in the room, I barely need to talk.
Yeah.
Right. And, so it completely depends on the person. It's not back to not a right answer, not a wrong answer. I think that depends. I also think on what are you providing, right? So, a classic example is a bespoke tailor as opposed to, a chain store.
Okay.
Even though they may still tailor the suit for you, right?
Right.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
It is not the same. They're making sure that the pant length is correct. And, they may be tucking in a little bit, at the waist or, letting it out a little bit at the hip or, whatever. That there may be making some adjustments, but it's not the same as a, completely bespoke, hand-tailored suit. And no one is expecting to pay, Men's Warehouse prices for a completely custom made suit.
Right.
Right. And so I think that's also, it's like, is it distinctive enough and do people understand the distinction enough that you can actually get that? And then I think the third place where you can, the bespokeness or the smallness is we are so niched in who we deal with that we know more about this topic than practically anybody. And we can go in so deep in ways that you can't possibly imagine that people are like, yeah, I need to pay for that level of expertise.
Okay. So if somebody's listening and they're thinking like, would I benefit from staying boutique or not? It sounds to me like the signs that they should be looking for is if their competitive advantage relies on personalized attention, customization, or to your most recent point, hyper-specific specialization and insight.
Right.
What you'd mentioned earlier, if you value flexibility and work-life balance, you have the greatest control over that, the smaller you are. If your most satisfied clients appreciate your direct involvement, that would be a sign where you would benefit from staying small. If you actually enjoy the craft or the service aspect more than you enjoy managing people, because you may not have to personally manage all the people if you scale out, but somebody is going to have to manage the people. And there is a cost associated to management. And then one of your very earlier points is if you've tried growth in the past and it has diluted the quality or the level of your service or the perception of what makes your business special. Those would all be signs that you would benefit from staying boutique. Now, what I'd like to do, Gwen, is I'd like to get your insight on what are some ways that you can increase profitability if you've made that decision to not increase volume.
So I think, this is the place where you can scale without actually growing.
Okay.
Because so often we're putting scale with growth, right? And that doesn't necessarily have to be true. We can actually do all of the work prior for real scaling without actually then doing the growth component. And the key thing there, quite honestly, is simplify. I mean, it's I love to make it complex, but that would be a little bit ironic because the answer is simplify, right? So it really is simplify. And so part of simplify is, do you need to be doing all of the things that you're doing? Right? That's another way that you can scale is simplify. So instead of offering the, 6 or 12 offerings, can you take it down to 3 or 4? Your most profitable 3 or 4, the ones that when I say profitable, I'm saying dollars, but I really mean profitable in all the ways, the time, the energy, the money, can we reduce that? Do you need to be doing all the things that you're doing and therefore need all the people that you need? Or can you cut back on what I'm going to say, some of the administrative services and or some of the marketing aspects, or, there's other things like do you really want and need to do all of that? That's a way that you can say, I don't need to have, a whole team of people making, 2 LinkedIn posts every day, 4, Instagram posts, and 5, updates every week on Facebook, right? I'm making something up here. When what you realize is that either all your people come from LinkedIn, like,
right.
as an example, right? It's like, okay, well, you could scale some of that back, which actually creates scale, right?
Yeah.
Or you could realize it's like, you know what? I could cut all of that by, 2/3, and I would still be getting some of the same responses. And so that's another place that you could scale. The other is, are there things that you can let go that you've been doing, but you're like, yeah, we don't actually need to do that. It's just something that I've been doing, or that I kind of like doing, but it's not really providing value. And or can you change or modify your services in a way that allows you to do a little bit more but still feel boutique, still feel small, without actually making, the big giant growth? Because the easiest way to increase profit always is to eliminate expense. It is not to increase income. That's the fastest way, because when you remove an expense, it goes directly to profit. When you add a sale, most of that goes to profit.
Right.
But depending on, you may also need more time from your people, more effort, more whatever. And so it doesn't actually go straight down to profit. But if I can take, $100 out of my expenses every month, that's $100 that's going to land right on profit without anything else changing.
Right.
So the simplifying of what can we remove, what can we eliminate, what can we reduce, is the way that you can use the scaling activity to actually increase your profit without necessarily growing the business at the same time. And our friend and wise associate Chris DeGasso always says, simplify before scaling. And that's really part of this, is if you can simplify, you can get the benefit of scaling without necessarily having to go bigger.
Okay. So that all makes sense. What would you say, though, to the person who says, but if I don't scale, won't I max out my potential income?
Yes.
Okay. So 100%, it is always true that a business that doesn't scale reaches a ceiling on income.
At some point, unless there is a reason that they can continue to raise their prices in infinitum, which is really, really rare, and not the impossible, but really, really rare. If you're selling water and at some point all water is gone, but you still have water, your income becomes almost infinite, right? But that it's a pretty unique situation. So there is a point, but part of it is the only way I'm wanting to make money is by the effort I'm putting into my business. Because this is outside our particular topic, but if you're making a nice solid income and aren't spending it all, you can be investing it. And that's a way that you also are increasing your income over time. Right. But yeah, if you don't grow, like at some point it's going to max out. But here's the part that most people don't get, is that's true with everybody. That's absolutely true with everybody.
Okay.
People, people are like, oh, but if I scale, I'm going to, I have infinite income. No, you don't, because you have to keep scaling forever.
Okay. So what would you say to the person
and what are you going to do with all that money? And is the money what's really driving you?
Well, I'm going to swim in it. That's what I'm going to do with all the money.
Yeah, that's what we say, but we're not. And the people who listen to this podcast, they're not. That is not their driver.
Probably not. So what about the person who wants to sell their business someday? Are boutique businesses sellable?
Oh, I think boutique businesses are very sellable, but this is back to, it's way less about the income, although the income obviously plays a factor. I can't say that it doesn't have any factor. But where the real value is in that profit line.
Right.
And so if you've grown your business and actually have scaled it so that the profit has actually gotten as big or bigger over time, right? Then yeah, you're absolutely in a position to sell it and probably at a very, very profitable piece. But once you sell it, there is no more income coming in.
Right.
Right. Now, sometimes that's a big enough number. You feel like, well, I don't need any more income coming in. But for most of us, it's really pulling back a huge chunk of the investment that we put in initially. Because often what people forget is how much they put in because they didn't necessarily put it in dollar for dollar. I got paid $24,000 this year for a job that anyone else would have wanted $80,000. Right? Okay. That's part of that money.
Right.
Right. But if that was 10 or 15 years ago, we've kind of forgotten about that now.
That's what we call a sunk cost.
Right. Right. But when we say, oh, we made all this money, it's like, but how much did you really make? Yeah. Right. Because some of that's actually that money finally coming back to you.
Right. Well, and I think sometimes with a business sale, at least some of the people I know who've sold their business, it's not about 2xing how much I've put into my business over the last 10, 15 years. It's about what's the price tag on not having to run this business anymore.
Right.
Right. And I have seen businesses that could have sold for $100,000 be sold for $20,000 because it was worth $20,000 for the founder to not have to wake up tomorrow and run the business anymore.
Right. Right.
Right. And they didn't want to hold out for a higher price tag. Okay. We have covered a ton of ground today, and this kind of comes to the end of our time today. So I think ultimately the message here is that intentionally staying small with your business doesn't automatically limit your success. What it does is it supports the definition of success on your own terms. And building a boutique business that plays to your strengths and values quality over quantity is a way of creating a sustainable enterprise for you based on your desired lifestyle and your financial goals. So what we're really talking about here is focusing on depth rather than breadth in some cases, so that you can create a deeper experience of value for both your client, but also for yourself. Gwen is famous for saying every yes requires a no somewhere, right? And so sometimes your most powerful strategic advantage is saying no to growth for growth's sake. Now, if you are ready to transform your business into one that supports rather than drains you, we have a great free resource that could help you figure out what that looks like. It is an assessment called Breaking the Burnout Cycle, which helps you figure out whether you're burned out, maybe what areas are leading to that burnout, and then helps you create a customized action guide that identifies your natural strengths, pinpoints where your current business model is working against you, and helps you get that step-by-step plan to transform your way out of it while supporting your well-being. Head over to thebusinessyoureallywant.com/burnout to download your copy today. And until next time, keep remembering that the only definition of success that matters is the one that you have set for yourself. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.